All right, and welcome back. As you know, summer session tends to be a little bit crunched. Every class time is essentially two class times, so we're kind of running at double time. So, uh, while we may not keep to this schedule always, I'm going to try to basically put up a couple hours of lectures every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, with a few exceptions. So hopefully you don't get overwhelmed. Again, because it's asynchronous, you can listen to these at your leisure. So if you're a day or two behind when you catch these, that's not a problem. But I do recommend don't let it go a week or two, because then pretty soon you've got a lot of videos that you got to catch up on. Well, let's get right into this. We're going to talk about prehistoric art. Prehistoric art is actually one of the most important subjects in all the history of art. I'm just going to say that right out front, because it is the first time that humans make art, and it deals with all the most important issues of what art is and why we make art. How did art come about? When you think about it, art's a little crazy. We make these things, we stick them on walls, we walk around in museums and galleries and look at it and say, oh, isn't this nice? And they aren't real. They are a kind of a lie. As Pablo Picasso said it, art is a lie that tells the truth. But why would you do this? Why would you create these things and then project all of these feelings and emotions on them? And so prehistoric art is a great place to answer those questions. We can really more clearly see why art became very, very important to us as a species, why the visual arts came about, and why it does seem to be this kind of extension, or maybe an invention, of human cognitive development. And so we're going to start this in a very odd place. We're actually going to start it with a painting that was painted in the 1920s, in the 20th century. This painting, in fact. Now, if you've taken 2720 or you've taken any modern art class, you're probably familiar with this painting. Or if you speak French, you can read the inscription at the bottom. But if you have, don't spoil it for anybody else if you know this painting. Instead, I want you to look at this painting and I want you to think in your mind, what is it that you see? Now, if you're like 99% of us, you're going to say it's a pipe. And now here's where the gag comes in, because the inscription at the bottom says, this is not a pipe. This was painted by René Magritte, who was a Belgian painter and a painter of the Surrealist movement. And the title of this painting is The Treachery of Images. And that's the kind of reality at the core of every image. An image is something pretending to be something else. It is not what it appears to be. It is something entirely different. It is not, in fact, a pipe. It is a painting of a pipe. Now, even in Magritte's time, people thought that was rather pretentious, and they said, oh, come on, get off it, it's a pipe. But he says, if it's a pipe, take it down off the wall, fill it full of tobacco, and go smoke it, which is a pretty good, way to kiss somebody off who doesn't like your artwork, I think. And it shows that art is a representation. It is not the truth. Let's take a look at another image. What is this? Well, if you're like 99% of us, you'd probably say, well, this is a happy face or a smiley face. And I would like to remind you that if you actually saw someone who looked like this in real life, you would probably go running in horror in the opposite direction. This person has no nose, no ears. Their proportions are entirely wrong. This is, in fact, not a face. It is a symbol. It is a gesture towards a face. It has the bare minimum necessary to recognize as a face. It is, of course, an abstraction. Let's also think about something like a house. If you gave a child a command to draw a house, you might see something like this. What's fascinating is children all over the West draw houses the same. They don't even draw houses that look like their houses. They draw stylized versions of houses. They're not actually drawing a house, they're drawing an emblem of a house. And that isn't really all that different. Even if you gave this same task to an architect, he's not going to draw an actual house. He's going to draw emblems or patterns. A floor plan is a representation of a house, but it certainly only gives one view of the house. The same thing is true if you talk about the human figure. Here we have two very different understandings of a human figure. On one side, we have a figure study, and on the other side we have these very simple petroglyphs done by Fremont Indians. Both communicate the essence of a person, but do it for very different intent, and yet they work very well. That's the nature of images. Art is a representation of a concept or object, real or imagined. It's not the thing itself. It is, as Picasso said, a lie that tells the truth. The equivalency between the image and the reality is accepted. When you look at this, you don't think painting, you think pipe. And it's precisely because you think pipe that this painting has power or efficacy. And it allows René Magritte to do this fun little kind of commentary on the nature, the treachery of images, how they fool us. And yet, if they didn't fool us, they wouldn't be very valuable at all. This ability to project meaning from one thing onto an image that is not that thing is very, very useful to the human species. And so how does this start? Where does this get going? And here we're going to go to probably one of the earliest objects that might be called an object of art or an artwork. And for this we have to go all the way down here to South Africa. Up here in the northeast regions of South Africa is a valley, and that valley is known as the Makapansgat Valley. The Makapansgat Valley is a nice little lush valley, but many millions, and yes, that's millions of years ago, it was home to a group of peoples known as Australopithecines. These were our earliest ancestors. There is a cave there where they dwelled and made residence, and in that cave they found this object. It's only about a couple inches high, and it's made out of jasperite. And this object falls into a category of objects we call manuport. Manuport literally is Latin for carried by hand. Of course, this was in the age before the existence of pockets or purses or backpacks. So if anything got to this location, it got there because it was carried by the hand of one of these early hominins, this Australopithecine family that lived there. Now the pebble is made out of jasperite, which is a kind of hard flinty stone that doesn't exist in the area. The nearest sources of it are maybe 30 kilometers away. And so that suggests that this wasn't brought to this location or just randomly found at this location. That means this was special to the people who found it, and they brought it back to their house for a reason. And what might that reason be? Well, as you look at this, there is a certain kind of quality it possesses. In fact, most people would say that if you look at this section right here, it resembles a human face. Now I want to point out, this is not crafted. This is not someone who dug in those eyes and that mouth. This is what we might call a geofact. A geofact is a geological object made by nature, but looks like it might have been made by man. And so rather than someone making this, someone found this. And after finding it, they turned it over and looked at it, and they did something rather quite crazy. They looked at it, and instead of saying, "Ooh, pebble," which is what it is, they said, "Ooh, face." That is, they projected a meaning onto it. And we actually have a little bit of evidence that that's how they saw it. I mean, we're talking 3 million years ago. We don't have any written records from that time period. We don't know who these people are, even if they had language. They probably didn't. And so there's no way we could know for certain what they thought about this. But there are tiny little scratches, and these scratches are man-made, and these scratches seem to reinforce the faceness or the aspects of this that look like a face. So that's some evidence that suggests that the people who picked this up valued it because it looked like a face, and that they projected the meaning of face onto it. Human beings have all kinds of software written into their brains that help them to recognize patterns, and one of those is one of those patterns that we recognize as faces. Faces are very important because it is through the human face that we interact with other people. You can speak to someone with a face, you can read their emotions, etc. But of course, a pebble can't interact. And so to project that kind of association, that salience of a face, onto a pebble is very strange indeed. Hopefully you've all seen the movie Castaway with Tom Hanks. You know exactly where I'm going. Wilson! He has a volleyball. And in that volleyball, he puts a bloody handprint, and then he draws a face in that bloody handprint. And then he relates to that because it has a face. And he develops a relationship to it. And I won't spoil the movie for you, but it's absolutely tragic when he loses the volleyball. It's like you're losing a real person. Well, I guess I just did spoil it for you. Okay, so I will spoil it for you. It's an old movie. You had your chance. So this strange thing is, why should we project meaning and attachment onto something that's an inanimate object? This also has a profound implications for the nature of art. What is it that makes art art? Is art the product of action or attachment? Generally, if you look up any definition of art, it says that art is an application of creative skill. I take clay, I take oils, paints, I take something, and I craft it, and I make an image. That's what art is. But that's actually putting the cart before the horse. Long before we can think of an image in our head and actually craft it, we have to have the ability to have this attachment to images. And so we have one argument that says conscious application of skill and craftsmanship is what makes art. Look up the Merriam-Webster dictionary. Art is the conscious use of skill and creative imagination, especially in the production of aesthetic objects. And that is that it's all about intent and will. But again, you can't have that intent and will until you have this ability to project attachment and meaning onto an inanimate object. And it has to do with things like memory and emotion, assimilation and reinterpretation of things. This ability to form attachments onto images and to project them onto inanimate objects is really interesting. Now here I think it's good to have a discussion about whether we're the only species in the world that actually makes art. As it turns out, the answer is no. If you provide an elephant with paints or a chimpanzee with paint, they will spontaneously paint. People discovered that elephants would actually pick up sticks and make marks in the mud, even in the wild, and they did this spontaneously. And they seemed to do it deliberately, as if they were crafting something. You can also see this in certain animals. This is the bowerbird. The bowerbird is this rare species of bird that will build a bower. And they will decorate it with whatever they can find. You can see this one decorated with a bunch of blue plastic. The bower serves no purpose. It doesn't do anything for the bird. About the only thing you can say it does is it attracts a mate. So a male bowerbird will build this, and a female bower will come along and say, hey, nice bower. But then when they're done, the two of them will abandon it and go on and build a nest and make a family together. It's surprising how many animals are capable of doing this. Divers had long noticed these strange radiating patterns in the sand, and it was only recently discovered that this was done by a pufferfish, that a pufferfish would use its body and its mouth to push out puffs of water to move sand and to make elaborate patterns. And it does it for the same reason. It does it to attract a mate. But again, in the case of the elephant, the chimp, the bowerbird, and the pufferfish, once they have attracted the mate, or once they've done it for whatever reason they've created it, they no longer hold an attachment to it. It moves on. As near as we can tell, humans are the only ones that develop this long-term attachment to an object and project meaning to it. And so when we look at early prehistoric art, things like the Venus of Willendorf, which we'll talk more about later, it's obvious this is a work of art. It was crafted, it shows clear intention and demonstration of skill. But can we say the same about the Makapansgat pebble? Just because I'm attached to something and I project this meaning of a face to it, is that enough to make this an art object? After all, humans get attached to all kinds of things. We have attachment to sunsets and puppy dogs and little kids. There is a feature of human psychology known as pareidolia. And pareidolia is the tendency to see patterns or faces in objects where no object was intended. One of my favorite examples of this is the face on Mars. The Mariner survey was this space probe that took a picture on Mars, took a picture of this thing called a face that looked rather like an Egyptian face, and people called it the face on Mars. It was only later that a later photograph demonstrated that it's just an ordinary butte. It's just a trick of light and shadow. This is similar to people seeing the face of Elvis in a grilled cheese sandwich, or the Virgin Mary in a rust pattern on a water tower. We see things that aren't there. Is that enough of a reason to describe this as art, though? Maybe. For example, when we get to the 20th century, there's a lot of things that are very minimalistic in their expression. One of my favorite examples is this. This is a bull's head by Picasso. But of course, if you look at it closely, you realize it's a bicycle seat and a set of handlebars. And all he did is took two familiar objects, rearranged them, recontextualized them to create something new, to create something that no longer says handlebars and bicycle seat, but says bull's head. And that comes because we can kind of project meaning to it. Perhaps a more extreme example is this famous one. This is the very famous Fountain by Marcel Duchamp. He assumed an alias and submitted this as a work of art. And of course, it's just a urinal laid on its side, and then he titled it Fountain. This is, of course, a urinal, and you wouldn't want to be eating anything, or drinking anything that came out of this fountain. It was seen as an absurdist movement. If you think that's absurd, and, well, congratulations, you got the joke. His whole point was to kind of make fun of the nature of art at the time. But it's become one of the most famous works of art in the 20th century because it carries this idea of absurdity with it. And so we see that even in the 20th century, you don't actually need to make something or even to exercise all that much skill or craft to create an image, that has meaning. You may not like the urinal, you may not like Marcel Duchamp's fountain, you may think it's a joke, but it definitely carries meaning. He meant it to be absurd and to actually cause a scandal, and it certainly did. So in some way, perhaps the Makapansgat Pebble, if it's not a work of art, it's very, very similar to things like Marcel Duchamp's fountain. It demonstrates the idea of a concept in an inanimate object. And so I think what this means is that art is really an extension of cognitive development. You really can't get to the idea of crafting something unless you have the ability to project images and to project meaning onto images or inanimate objects. So art is a kind of object that serves no obvious utilitarian purpose, but instead it satisfies the viewer or the creator on some other conceptual or abstract level. Maybe aesthetic, maybe religious, personal, social identity. There's all kinds of reasons why it satisfies you. It's not a spear, it's not a tool, or at least it's not a tool in the regular sense. It's not a tool that helps you do something physical. Instead, it's a tool that helps you deal with the mental or the spiritual or the metaphysical. And so we really can't talk about, art without talking about how humans developed this ability to project meaning onto something inanimate. And that's really, we're talking about the ability of abstract thought. We're talking about this higher level cognitive development, this incredible abstract ability to abstract thought and concepts, to come up with words and concepts and forms and ideas. And that means we have to talk about human evolution. When and where we started in this? Well, the history of human evolution starts in Africa. All the hominin species develop in Africa and then spread out from there. And the earliest range of human development is going to be here in East Africa, in what we call the East African Rift Valleys. This is part of the same rift valleys that go all the way up through Egypt. This is a part where the two plates in Africa are spreading apart. And this is where human evolution seems to have begun. These are the nations of Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, into the Horn of Africa. The early hominins, the very earliest species that might be called human, are the Australopithecines, and they evolved sometime around 2.5 to 1 million years ago. And then we have another group that comes in after that, the Homo erectus. Let's start with the Australopithecines. So the Australopithecines had a range that was mostly limited to East Africa. If you got down to South Africa, but that's about it. They were very, very primitive, and they probably looked very ape-like. They walked upright and had a bipedal posture, but they had very much ape-like faces and ape brain cases. They did work in stone tools, but they had very limited tool-making capability. We do find things like manuports, these carried-by-hand objects. We find that things like crystals or shells were carried over great distances. And we can't think of any reason why they valued these, other than they valued them for their aesthetic quality. They projected some kind of meaning on it. And these are the people who made these things we call manuports. And these are the people who probably created the Makapansgat pebble. Or I say created, rather, these are the ones who picked up the Makapansgat pebble and projected meaning onto it. And maybe that's enough to make this the first work of art. I don't know. This is a very controversial item, and you'll see people go back and forth on what is the first work of art or not. But then we move into the time period of the Homo erectus. By the time we move into the Homo erectus, we're talking about a time scale from about 1 million to 100,000 years ago. And these people had pretty good tool-making capability, and they also mastered fire. They had no permanent settlements, no human burials or funeral practices, that's important, and as near as we can tell, no discernible art. But these were the first humans to actually spread out into the world. The first to leave Africa, cross over into the Middle East, and then cross over into Asia and Europe. They had large communities, they hunted, they made fire, and they also made tools. They were pretty much master tool makers. They were much more skilled than the Australopithecines, who more or less could put an edge on a rock and that's it. These guys made finely made tools in these beautiful teardrop shapes. We call these things Acheulean hand axes because they were first discovered in the Achill Valley in France. But they're beautiful objects, perfectly symmetrical. And if you've ever done any flint knapping, worked with flint or obsidian, you know how hard it is. And so this shows the great skill that was employed in making these. Now again, we have to talk to the animal world. Many animals make tools. Here's a finch using a stick. Crows, corvids, all kinds of creatures have been known to make tools, primates, etc. But the difference is when they make those tools, they pretty much use them once and abandon them and move on. They're only there to exploit a kind of evolutionary advantage. The finch uses it to get bugs out of little holes in rotting wood. But humans actually retain tools, improve on them, and pass them down, and teach their descendants how to make better tools. And this is the origins of what we call culture. Basically, the basic baseline anthropology definition of culture is anything that you weren't born knowing how to do, walking, breathing, all that other stuff, you learned through culture. It was taught to you. And so transmitted knowledge across generations is culture. And so the fact that these stone tools are so finely crafted and continue are in fact one of the best evidences of the development of the cognitive ability to make art. And here's where we run into Dennis Dutton. Dennis Dutton was a philosopher. He specialized in the philosophy of aesthetics. He worked at UCLA. Regrettably, he passed away not long ago. But he came up with what he called a Darwinian theory of beauty. That is, where he argued that these hand axes, these Acheulean hand axes, were far more than just simple chop, bash, and chop kind of tools, that they were in fact the first works of art. And if that's true, that makes them the longest lasting tradition of art in the history of the world, because they were making these for nearly 1 million years. It's really remarkable. And he argues that they were made to show the same, they showed the same advantages that the bowerbird did. The bowerbird makes this beautiful bower, and this proves that it is skilled. It proves that it is a good mate choice. And he thinks that that's the same thing, that, we use of high prestigious materials, high use of skill, and that's what they were used for. And when you look at them, it's not hard to believe it, because they really are very finely crafted and very expertly made, very thin. There's no reason why you have to make them symmetrical either. I mean, if you just need a sharp rock to bash something open or to cut something or to scrape something, any sharp rock will do. The symmetry, particularly the teardrop symmetry, is something that isn't necessarily needed. So this is above and beyond the call. There's also a little bit of evidence to suggest that he might be right in the sense that some of these things seem to have never been used. They were buried intentionally, and you might say, well, they were buried because he expected to come back to them later, and so he cached them that way. But maybe not. Maybe he buried them as votive objects, as kind of devotions, maybe to a god or something of that nature. And because they were never used, they were more symbolic objects. I think the best piece of evidence is that some of them are gigantic. You know, usually they're small things. They can fit in the palm of a hand, like this. They fit very nicely into a hand. But some of them are, you know, more than a foot tall. You can't imagine picking up a gigantic stone that's a foot long and using this to go after some animal. It would be unwieldy. So one suggests that they just made it bigger so that they could kind of increase the importance of it. That suggests that it wasn't a workable tool. It may have started out that way, but it had become something else. It had become a work of art and was used to convey meaning or to impress a mate or some other reason. We may never know. Again, none of these people had any written language. There's no way they could ever communicate to us. We don't even know if they had language themselves. So that brings us into the Paleolithic. So we have very little evidence. We have evidence that's kind of tantalizing that prior to the Paleolithic, we have this long tradition of Acheulean hand axes. We have this evidence that people are forming attachments to objects, that they're crafting them intentionally, that they're projecting meaning onto them more than just their utilitarian meaning. But it's really when we get to the Upper Paleolithic that we start to see some evidence of what might be called art. And we have two species that arrive at this time. The first is the Homo Sapiens Neanderthalis, so named because he was first found in the Neander Valley. Tal is valley in German, and so he was found in the Neander Valley. And the other one is Homo sapiens sapiens, which we sometimes call Cro-Magnons. And we call these Cro-Magnons because they were found in the Cro-Magnon Valley in France. That was where they were first found. So let's take a look at the Neanderthals first. They had advanced tool-making capability just like the Homo erectus. They also had fire. They had permanent settlements. But the big thing is they had burials. We'll talk about that in a second. Their range was mostly spread across southern Europe, but also into the Middle East. They also seem to have intermarried and mixed. There's also another group out there called the Denisovans, which are further into Asia that seem very similar to the Neanderthals, but are a distinct group. And they had very complex societies. I love this diorama here because it shows this individual right here with a missing hand. And that's not because they did that by accident. It's because we find graves and burials of people with missing hands and broken limbs. And that shows that the family cared for them long enough for the wound to heal, and that even though a person was missing a hand, he still had value to the group. He could transmit knowledge. It's the burials that are really the thing that speak the most. We find a number of Neanderthal burials. The figures are usually buried on their side in the fetal position, and there's great care taken over the bodies. The bodies are buried with traces of pigment, red ochre. Red ochre is a mineral, and it doesn't exist everywhere. You have to go find it, and it may have been ground down into body paint. And so this might be evidence that body painting is the first art form. It's fascinating. We also found evidence of flower pollen. The flower pollen indicates they might have been buried with flowers. So that's a very ancient tradition, if true. And it suggests that they liked flowers because they were pretty, that they had this aesthetic sense. But it's the burial itself that says the most about the Neanderthals. If you were a Homo erectus and someone in your troop died, you would just walk away like an animal. You would leave the body to be eaten by the vultures and by the scavengers, and you didn't protect it. The fact that the Neanderthals buried their dead suggests that they regarded the body as an image of the deceased. It's always very troubling to see someone that you've loved who's passed on. I've had this a couple of times when you see somebody in a viewing, because it's them, it's the same body, but it doesn't look like them. The anima, the soul, the life essence, whatever you want to call it, is clearly gone. And so the body is obviously not them, but it looks just like them. And so in a weird kind of way, the human body is kind of like a work of art that represents the person who is gone. It is an image of the person. It is not the person. Because, again, whatever made them vital and alive, the soul, the anima, whatever you want to call it, is gone, and obviously so. And so it's not surprising then that burials are an indication of this higher cognitive development, that you are projecting meaning onto this image, this remnant of whatever was left behind. Now this is fast forwarding several thousand years into the future, but when we think about it, images of the body and associations of the body is one of the most important things in all the ancient world. These are plastered skulls. We'll talk more about them when we get to the Neolithic period. But these plastered skulls show that people wanted to preserve the likeness or the essence of who these people were. They would take the skull and they would recreate the flesh in plaster. They would even put shells in the eyes because eyes are wet and they glisten, and shells have a shine to them. So they even used materials that replicated the quality of the body. Excuse me. Yes, I coughed into my elbow in case you're curious. I also have my bleach wipes and 5 months of toilet paper stacked up, so we're all good to go here. So this quality of preserving the human body and giving it certain deference and treating it in this way seems to go all the way back to the Neanderthals. So what we see here is this is obviously some important bridge. That the body and reverence for the body is what will lead us to things like ideas like portraiture and the rendering of the human form. But there's not much more other than that. And this, of course, brings us to this tumultuous age known as the Intermittent Glaciation, more commonly known as the Ice Age. Hopefully you know from history that there have been many, many ice ages in the history of the world, some very deep and very prolonged. But there was a particularly deep one that we just came out of, relatively speaking, from about 40,000 years ago up to about, 9,000 years ago is when we finally started to come out of it. Excuse me. And this period is a time where huge ice sheets cover North America and Europe. It's a very harsh time. A lot of species that survived before the Ice Age don't survive on the other side coming out. It's also the period of the first technological revolution. There's been many technological revolutions in human history. The agricultural revolution, bronze. Of course, we are living through the information revolution right now. We had the industrial revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries. But this was the first technological revolution, a huge change in how people lived their lives. And it happened around the year 40,000 BCE. We see a huge proliferation of stone tools, massive different variety of specialization. Before 40,000, we have simple Acheulean hand axes, scrapers, these kind of things. But after this, we see things like needles. So people are, in fact, sewing clothes. We see microblades and bifacial complex spear points. We even see harpoons, because now they're hunting fish and animals. And this advance in technology, this huge advance in this incredible diversity of tools, is strongly associated with a group that we call Homo Sapiens sapiens, or more commonly Cro-Magnons, which are first found in the Cro-Magnon Valley. And these people are us. We sometimes call these people anatomically modern humans. Their brow ridges and their skulls were a little bit thicker than ours. They tended to get their wisdom teeth without any problems, unlike us. But other than that, they were us. They look like us in virtually every single way. If you took a Neanderthal and you gave him a shave and put him in a suit and put him on a public bus, you would look at him and say, yeah, something's wrong with that dude. He would not look human. But if you did the same for a Cro-Magnon, give him a shave and a haircut and put him in a suit on a bus, you wouldn't have any idea that he's not a normal human. He would look normal in every way. And these people really did have very sophisticated tool-making capabilities. And wherever they go and wherever they show up, we see definitive art. Not kind of art, not stuff that might have been art, but stuff that is indisputably art. And these are the people that eventually conquer the world. They start in Africa. They start migrating out of Africa, maybe 125,000 years ago. And by the time we reach 12,000, 14,000 years ago, they have settled virtually every single part of the globe. Maybe some islands in the Pacific they hadn't reached, but other than that, they had reached it all. It's really quite remarkable. They were wanderers and explorers on an incredible level. Just daring. They were given to long walks. If you see people run marathons and do the big races today, well, they're living up to their heritage because we were walkers and runners. I know I'm not. I would, pretty much rather die than have to walk 26 miles. But there we are, let alone run it. And they were also the first artists, so much so that we can actually identify them by groups. We have whole periods where they have certain styles that identify them. So we can tell the difference between a Gravettian and a Solutrean or a Magdalenian. We know who they were. And the artwork they produced is just indisputably art. Paintings on walls, monumental paintings, really intricate carvings like this reindeer antler that has been carved into a stone weight for a spear thrower. And it has the details of this bison and his beard. It's really incredible. Now, if you go back to, say, the way things were taught in textbooks, 30 years ago, when I was an undergrad, yeah, I'm old, this all kind of made sense. This made sense that we have this Ice Age revolution, we have a technological revolution, and right at the same time, we have a revolution in art. And not surprisingly, you have these Homo sapiens, these Cro-Magnons pop up at about the same time, which strongly suggested that this was really just the product of evolution. We were just smarter than the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals had sloping foreheads and didn't have a very large frontal lobe. They did have a very large occipital lobe. It's kind of strange. Neanderthal brains are actually larger than ours. They have a massive occipital bun on the back of their head. That's the part that processes visual information. You can see their eyes are just amazingly gigantic. Whereas, most of our brains are up top and up front. And the thinking was, well, this is the part that deals with higher function. This is the part that deals with visualization and abstraction. So we were just smarter. We were just more evolved. And that's why art and all the great stone tools happened. Because weren't we special? And that's what I was taught when I was an undergrad. And then something happened. Some archaeologist had to go keep digging. Ugh. And he did, and he discovered that, in fact, Cro-Magnons are not nearly as young as we think they are. That they are, in fact, a very, very old species. And the evidence is pushing them back before 100,000 BC. And there's some people who think that we might have been on this planet for a very long time, for more than 200,000 years. And this causes a huge problem. Because now that we have anatomically modern humans on the planet, why don't they behave like humans? Why don't they act like humans and make art and fancy tools? And so we've had to create this split, and that is the split between anatomically modern humans, that is humans that look like us, and behaviorally modern humans, that is humans that act like us. And we have this big question, why didn't humans create art before the Ice Age technological revolution? Why are some of our ancestors making wonderful stuff 40,000 years ago, and our ancestors 200,000 years ago were not? Did they undergo some subtle cultural or biological change? Was there some tiny little switch turned in on our brains? We also have to consider art may just be an invention. You know, why do we only have monumental art after the Ice Age technological revolution? Did no one just think of it before? I mean, think about all the evolution, think about all the inventions in history. Some of them are pretty simple. And it kind of amazes me that it took us as long to think them up. If you think of something like the horse stirrup, if you're into horses, we domesticated horses sometime around 1100 BC, but no one invented a horse stirrup until 500 CE, so nearly 1600 years later. Horse stirrup seems pretty simple. I can't believe, you know, it's kind of funny to think about all those movies where you see ancient Rome or Greece and they're riding around with stirrups. Yeah, BS. Wasn't true. Nobody had stirrups back then. And it seems hard to believe that we could have gotten around without it, but we did. So maybe we just got by without art. Maybe art was invented. And maybe it was just someday some guy was drawing in the dirt and one of his friends comes along and goes, ooh, you know, and that's it. That's how art was invented. We just don't know. It also begs the question, you know, what on earth were we doing if it wasn't invented and it wasn't some subtle little tiny switch turned in our brains by some subtle biological change? What on earth were we doing for all those hundreds of thousand years? Why isn't there art before the Ice Age technological revolution? Or at least not very complicated art. Things like the Makapansgat pebble and the Acheulean hand axes. There isn't anything that we can say is indisputably art. There's just a few things that might be art-ish. So this becomes even more problematic when you consider language. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's do a test. So this is a very fun test to do. What I'm going to do is I'm going to flash a word up on the screen here in a few seconds. What I want you to do is to try very hard not to think of the following object when I put the word up on the screen. Okay, so hopefully you understand what the goal is. I'm going to put a word up on the screen and you're going to try your darndest not to think of what that word means. I'm going to try to blank out your mind and not think of it. Okay, so you're ready? Okay, so try very hard not to think of the following object when I say the word elephant. Go. How long did you last? A second? Maybe two? If you're like most human beings on the planet, when I said elephant, you thought of an elephant almost instantaneously, and you could not push the image of the elephant out of your mind. And if you're like most people, you probably didn't just think of the word elephant, you probably thought of the idea of the elephant. You probably saw its trunk, its big ears, its tusks, its massive legs, and its gray skin, all the rest of it. And that's interesting because I didn't actually give you a picture of an elephant. I just gave you the word elephant. And the word elephant is an abstraction. There's many different languages on the planet and they all have their own word for elephant. So, you know, it's just an abstraction. These things, these letters, you know, they're just abstract symbols. There are many different writing systems. And yet you thought of an actual elephant. Huh. Fascinating, huh? Well, this is why visual culture and language is a problem. Because by all accounts, we have complex social organization going all the way back to 80,000 BC. 80,000 BC, we see humans hunting together. If you're going to hunt large animals, you kind of need to coordinate. You need a game plan. And that means that you and your friends got to get together and say, okay, I'm going to come around and corner off the mammoth on this side, and you're going to corner him on this side. And that means you have to plan all of these things in advance. You have to have a sense of time, which means you have to have a sense of memory. You have to have a sense of projecting that into the future. And all of that suggests language. The only way we know that people could coordinate that kind of behavior is through language. And you can see this. If you go to your dog and you say, "Dog, tomorrow I will give you some bacon," the dog isn't going to understand that. All they know is bacon, 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 and they're going to want bacon right then and there. They don't have this ability to use language to plan into the future like we do. And yet, by the evidence of us hunting and other things, it suggests that we had this a long time ago. Okay, so language means you have the capacity for abstraction. It means you have the capacity for visualization. If I go up to my friend, Thag, fellow caveman, and I say, Thag, tomorrow we hunt the mammoth. Presumably when I say mammoth, he knows what that means. That's an abstraction. He knows that the words coming out of my mouth mean this big shaggy elephant creature, and we're going to go hunt it. And so that means he has to be able to have the image of the elephant in the mind. He can abstract images. Language means you can abstract images. But if you can abstract images, why don't you try to actually create one? This is such a problem for art history and visual culture. Remember that, it's going back to our pipe, an art is just an image. It's just an image that represents a concept, an abstraction. And the equivalency between the image and the reality is accepted. So if you have a word for mammoth, you have the ability to abstract visual images. And if you do have the ability to do that, you have the ability to make an image to attach that abstraction to. And yet, until the Ice Age, nobody ever did it. And the big question is, why? Why? And so, again, we have to break into this question. Maybe it's because it hadn't been invented yet. Maybe there was a first time, and that first time happened in the Ice Age. Or maybe we're looking in the wrong place. We do have to consider that there might have been a very vast culture of visual arts before the Ice Age. And we have to talk about visual culture before, monumental art. Here we see a Cro-Magnon woman decorating the face of a child. So we have to consider things like body art, tattoos, scarification, ornamentation, or jewelry. These are things that we wouldn't easily recognize because they wouldn't last. We also have to consider things like performance, dance, ritual. That includes costumes, shamanism, storytelling as a part of art. There are many tribes in West Africa that still practice scarification to this day. This individual has had his body intentionally scarred. Same is true for tattoos. I went to a water park with my family a few years back, and I discovered I'm practically the only person in the world without a tattoo. Seems like they're very, very common. So, but there's also things like body paint. Here's some Wolverines showing their Wolverine pride, but this isn't going to last much longer than the game, and you go home and you wash this off. Few crazed fans might wear it all week, but that's about as far as you're going to get. This stuff isn't going to survive, so if our ancestors did this, we would never know. We do have some evidence at later periods that maybe they did dress up as animals. This is a figure from a cave in France from a much later period that shows a person apparently transforming into a deer, and maybe it shows a shaman dressing up as a deer, taking on the deer's spirit. And so maybe they were doing dress up, but of course the things they were dressing up would have been made from animal hide, and they would have rotted away long ago. They wouldn't have survived. We do have to remember that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we don't have something yet doesn't mean it didn't exist. A lot of things don't survive because they're made out of non-durable materials. A lot of things we have, particularly from the ancient prehistoric world, we have just because of the accident of history. Consider these two things. These are amazing. So these are two bison made out of clay. They were made at the bottom of a cave. And this is unfired clay. This is before the invention of ceramics. So this is just mud. If you picked these up and put them in a bucket of water, they would dissolve back into mud. So how did they survive over, 15,000 years? Well, somebody went into the cave, drew up the mud from the bottom of the cave, crafted these bison, and then left. And then nobody ever went back. And then miraculously, somehow, not only did no one ever go back into the cave maintained a perfect climate. It was never flooded for the next several thousand years. And then somebody stumbled into it and found these things. It's really remarkable. And just look at them. They're really beautifully done. I guarantee you this is not the first time this guy modeled some bison. I'm pretty certain he was sculpting bison all the time, probably around the campfire, but none of those survived. So imagine the artwork that could have been created that just disappeared if it was made out of mud or wood or something that just didn't survive. There's also the issue of cultural differences. Just because you make something out of art doesn't mean you make it to survive. This is a big bias of Western art. Western art, we love monumentality, we love permanence, we love statues out of stone and bronze, big shiny things that are going to last forever and, speak to future generations of our greatness. But not every culture has those kind of objections or those kind of priorities, I guess I should say. And they oftentimes have religious prohibitions against making works of art, or their art fills some ritual purpose or utility. Here's one of my favorite examples. These are San mandalas painted by Tibetan monks. So a mandala is a kind of cosmological map. It's a map not to a real location, but to a mystical or metaphysical location, usually Mount Meru, this kind of mystical location that represents enlightenment or inspiration. And Buddhist monks will create these. They create them with really fine grains of sand. They have specialized tools that, if you strum them, they vibrate and allow grains of sand to flow out. And they paint these beautiful sand mandalas. And sometimes these things take weeks, if not months, to create. Then when they're done, they perform a ritual. And at the end of that ritual, the sun mandala is just swept up and is literally thrown away. I kid you not. And when people see this, if they've never seen this before, they're just like, oh! They just can't believe it. They can't believe that anybody would destroy this beautiful thing. But of course, if you know Buddhism, that's the whole point. Buddhism believes in this samsara, this wandering, this complete, the flow of all things, the flow of life. So you would sweep up the sand, put it into a bowl, and then empty the bowl out into a river or a stream, and it would flow out to the sea, and it's lost. Nothing is permanent in Buddhism. And so therefore, this emphasizes that. You can't even imagine somebody going to so much effort. And a lot of these aren't even photographed, so there's no record of them. It exists at all. But if ancient peoples had this kind of worldview, they might have been drawing enormously beautiful drawings in the sand and the dust, and they never would have survived. Of course, all of this brings us back to the question of Neanderthal art. For the longest time, other than the burials, maybe the body ochre, the red ochre body paint, we didn't see any evidence that they did anything that created art. In fact, the impression of Neanderthals was that they were rather dumb and dim-witted. But we do have to question now, well, if Homo Sapiens sapiens, if Cro-Magnons weren't making art, maybe the Neanderthals, were making art, and we lost it too. So if we've lost the record of Cro-Magnon art, we also have to recognize that there's now a fair amount of overlap between these two. In fact, there's overlap in more ways than one. We now know that genetically they are linked to us, that we interbred with the Neanderthals. We were two separate species. So some of us may have Neanderthal DNA. I know that's probably where I get my ape-like long arms from and my short stature. Either that or hobbits, I don't know. So some of us may have a little bit of Neanderthal blood in us. And if that's the case, then, if we crossed over that ways, maybe we'd have crossed over other ways. And it used to be that Neanderthals were seen as savage brutes. This is a painting by Frank Frazetta, one of my favorite fantasy artists, that portrays them. But of course now we portray them more as much more like people. And we see evidence that they adapted to Cro-Magnon technology. And while they died out in the Ice Age, they may have been making their own art. Very recently, and I mean very, very recently, like in the last year, someone published a study that suggested that these ladder-like figures here, these things right here, are older than any other paintings in the cave. And that most of the paintings in the caves date to the Cro-Magnon period, but the suggestion is that these are much, much older, and that the only people living in the cave at the time this was made were Neanderthals. If so, this is probably the earliest art on human record. And the only art definitively made by someone who isn't a human, somebody who is from one of these cousins of ours, the Neanderthals or elsewhere. It's a very interesting idea, but the truth is we just don't know. There's just too little evidence. So, while there's a lot of tantalizing ideas out there about when and where art got started, as far as we know, only behaviorally modern humans made art. And that is us. Homo sapiens sapiens, Cro-Magnons. You're a Cro-Magnon. Be proud. So if someone says you're a Cro-Magnon, you go, hell yeah. Anyhow, it's not an insult. Not at all. These people were incredibly smart and incredibly talented and beautiful artists. And as far as we know, only art on a monumental scale is made by them, and only after the Ice Age revolution. And that means that art might have been an invention. It might have been something that they needed at that time, and necessity forced the invention of it. What that necessity could be, we'll talk about in a bit. But once we get past the Ice Age, into the tail end of the Ice Age technological revolution, boy, is there a ton of art. There's a lot of it. And what's astonishing about it is we didn't know about any of it up until the 19th century. The first cave that was discovered was Altamira. It was discovered entirely by accident. A boy fell down into the cave and they rescued him, and he kept talking about the bison that were on the ceiling. And no one had seen the bison because it's a low cave and they were all bent over, so they didn't look up. But he, being a little kid, could look up and see the bison and see the paintings. And at first people thought they were a hoax. But then later, Lascaux, it says 19th century there, but I think it's actually 1940. Lascaux was discovered in 1940, Kosker, and they're still discovering them. Kosker Cave in 1985, Chauvet Cave in 1995. It's really remarkable. And they're incredible. They have huge, beautiful paintings of horses, bison, all kinds of Ice Age animals. So let's take a look at this region. So this is Europe. We're going to be taking a look at a lot of maps, and most of the cave sites are going to come from this section of Europe. So southern France and Spain. There's a few others scattered around the Mediterranean, but mostly it's going to be this section right here, in and around either side of the Pyrenees, the set of mountains that divide Spain from France. Altamira is right there, and Lascaux is right there. You'll also notice that most of these are on the coast, and that's important. Remember that this was during the Ice Age. There was a lot more ice, and that meant that the oceans were lower. And so even though some of these are on the coast today, they were actually probably pretty far inland at the time. And that means that many, many sites have probably been flooded. In fact, Kosker is a flooded site. We'll take a look at that. So let's just take a look at this. If you take a look at this, this is the best way to kind of get a sense of where these sites are located. So here, if you take a look, this will fly us down to the northern coast of Spain. And right here in a low bluff of hills is where Altamira Cave was located. Okay, so I've already done the animation. We can stop that. And the cave was a very low cave, and most of the bison are painted on the ceiling. If you look, you can tell that there are these nodules. There's these kind of bumps on the ceiling. And what they did is they turned those bumps into the bison. You can see how the paintings follow the cracks and the topography of the ceiling. It's really quite remarkable. That's significant. We'll talk about that in a minute. Another feature that we recognize is how incredibly naturalistic they are. These were people that really understood these animals. The subject matter is mostly Ice Age mammals, which makes sense because these are the animals they hunted. But look at the detail. We have the beard of the bison. I love how they know that, you know, if you're looking at a bison, one leg is going to be kind of back this way. This creature has a sense of modeling, that parts of it are shaded and highlighted, other parts are done in 3 dimensions. You know, quite frankly, a lot of first-year drawing students don't know as much about dimension and perspective as these artists did. And they're really rather breathtaking, really complicated, compelling pieces of work. The technique is also amazing. They're actually blown onto the surface of the rock. Sometimes you see them reconstructing this by blowing the paint directly out of their mouth. They would take the paint in their mouth and blow it right onto the wall. Other times you see them reconstructions, perhaps they put it in a vessel made out of an animal bone and blew across the top of the vessel to spread the paint. But however they did it, they were very, very sophisticated in their technique. The paintings are made out of mineral pigments and things like lamp black, yellow ochre, red ochre. And again, you can't find these pigments everywhere. You've got to go hunt them down, mine them. And if you just blow pigments on a wall, they're not going to stick much more than a few years. So they actually chewed animal fat to create binders to mix with the paint so the paint would actually stick to the wall. All paints have to have a binder in them to get them to stick. And then blowing them onto the wall is really something magical about it. It's almost like you're breathing it into life. And for handprints, they would just put their hand up against the wall and blow across their hand. And so there is a sense of the cave artist. There's some kind of sense of the signature of the artist, where the artist is putting his identity or his person, a kind of symbol of his being, using his hand as a stencil into the wall. But all of these are made mostly by breathing this. They would take their hands and use them as stencils. And if you ever blown a trumpet, you can make a puff of air going, and you just make a really quick, strong puff of air, and it atomizes the paint and works really, really well. I've had a few students recreate this technique, and it takes a bit of learning, but once you do it, it's amazing how well it works. Lascaux Cave is probably the most famous of these because it has the large hall of the bulls, where you have this enormous upper shoulder of the entire cave is decorated in many dozens of animals. So Lascaux is located in France, and so we're going to fly in here. And Erectus is along a kind of low bluff of hills, and it's underneath that hill. If you go there today, you don't actually go to the real Lascaux. You go to a fake Lascaux. They make a fake cave right next to the real cave because so many people were coming into the cave that their breath and the moisture from their breath was damaging the paintings. So you can only go to the real cave if you're an art historian who specializes in it. Otherwise, you go to the fake cave next door. But the fake cave has has all of the same paintings. It's really a remarkable reproduction. And if you go there, there are these series of literally dozens of animals, large bulls, etc. You have bulls, horses. The Solutreans painted these, and the Solutreans were horse eaters. They ate a lot of horses. It was long before they domesticated them. And again, we're still finding caves. There are new discoveries at Chauvet and Kosker. Chauvet is really interesting because it's some of the first to actually show prey animals, or predator animals, excuse me, like lions and hyenas. And Kosker is interesting because it's actually on the coast. This one was discovered by scuba divers. Scuba divers dove down and went through this underwater cave and popped up into a dry section of the cave and were astonished to find cave paintings. And those cave paintings are appropriately of sea animals. These are great auks. They're these great flightless birds that lived on the coast. So we have to assume that with the ocean levels being so much lower, that this was just a dry cave at the time that it was painted. And there's probably many of these caves that have been inundated. Most people today, about 80% of the human population, lives close to the coast. So not surprisingly, that's probably true at the same time. Makes sense. There's a lot of resources near the coast, animals and great auks. And if you eat great auks, that's where you find them. Chauvet Cave is really startling. These guys must have been the self-declared badasses of the hunting world because their cave is full of some of the most dangerous animals. Leopards, hyenas, lions, woolly rhinoceroses, just really incredibly tough stuff. So I don't know, maybe they had a chip on their shoulder. And we presumably they're painting pictures of the things that they hunt. But it's here that we get a sense of maybe what these paintings are all about. And you can particularly see it in this scene. This is a scene of a woolly rhinoceros. And if you look at this woolly rhinoceros, he has been overpainted many times. You can see that that horn has been painted, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, at least 7 times. And then his back the same. So what's going on here? Well, what was cave art for? The short answer is we don't know, but we have a lot of clues. The biggest thing is that these aren't habitations. There's no trash pits, trampled floors, or fire rings. There's no evidence that they were cooking or dumping trash. In fact, when the first explorers in the 19th century went into these caves, they had torches, and the torches left scorch marks on the walls. But people noticed, they said, wait a minute, there's no scorch marks from the prehistoric period. So how did they light this? Well, they lit them with stone lanterns. They actually carved shallow bowls into the stones into shallow bowls that they used as lanterns, and they used animal tendons as wicks, so that they had clear, bright, burning light. These were sacred places. They were not places that they were living. Sometimes these cave paintings are many hundreds of meters into the cave, so they're not doing this at the surface or near the entrance where they might be living. They're doing this right into the belly of the cave. So they're going deep into the earth. Again, probably because going into it is very mysterious, very mystical, gave them a sense that they were getting to some kind of magical source of Mother Earth itself. And we suspect that these are renewal rituals or rites of passage, although we don't know. If this is true, then some of these caves were active over several thousand years of use, generation after generation, for thousands, tens of thousands of years, kept coming back to these caves and painting them. That makes them the oldest continuously occupied religious sites in human history. There's nothing even close to that. The subject matter is mostly Ice Age mammals, although there are a few variations like the great auks. And it seems to be that they are painting the animals that they hunt. There's a monumental scale that most of these are very large, but there's no consistent scale. Some are painted 20 feet or 30 feet wide, much larger than the actual animal. Some are painted a little bit less than life size, and they're not consistent. And there's a great deal of overlapping or redrawing. So when we look at this, you might be tempted to think, oh, this is a herd of animals. But it's not a herd of animals. It's actually one animal painted one at a time and then painted over the top of the previous animals. You can see how this bison here overlaps with this horse, or how this bison here overlaps this bison over on this side. There doesn't seem to be any respect for the previous iteration. You can see that here at Lascaux Cave in the Hall of the Bulls. You have an earlier animal that was painted, and some artist came along and said, yeah, whatever, and he painted a much larger animal right over the top of it. So that suggests that it's not the image itself, it's the painting of the image, that the image exists for the purpose of a ritual, and then once that ritual is over, it's no longer respected and you can paint any image you want right over the top of it. We even see that the images are reused or repainted. So here's a lion, and the lion has been painted once, but then they renewed this lion by painting a new eye onto it. And then they painted a new lion head. So this isn't two lions side by side. This is actually the same lion, and his head has been renewed several times. You can even see there's another back or another head there. You can see the same thing with this horse, that they drew the horse, and that this isn't a herd of horses. This is one horse that's had its head redrawn multiple times. In this case, you can clearly make this out. Here's a mammoth. This one isn't painted, it's scratched into the wall. But they've drawn the back of the mammoth the first time, and they drew a second back. So here's from Chauvet Cave, and you can see how this diagram shows that you have the first iteration, the second, and then finally the third iteration. So what's going on here? Why would you draw these animals in the first place, and then why would you redraw them once you've drawn them? And that suggests that these aren't, again, herds, but they're individual animals, and that the overlapping and redrawing is a kind of a renewal of the animal's spirit in some way. A major clue was discovered when somebody noticed that in addition to only overlapping and redrawing, we also had strike marks. These are not painted on, but are actually made with a stone tool, like a stone spear point. So what we're seeing here is the symbolic killing and renewal of these animals. You would paint the animal, perhaps, and because these are so well painted. They're so expertly painted. We have to believe that these are professionals painting it. This is not just every person doing this. This is somebody who's practiced in painting this. And it may be that the first artists were also regarded as the first shaman, the first spiritual gurus or guides. So you would go down into this cave, and there's maybe a couple different ways this could work. You would go down into this cave, and the shaman would paint the animal. And maybe this was the animal that you were going to hunt. Maybe you were a young hunter coming of age and this was your first hunt. And they would paint the animal, and then you, with your stone knife or stone spear, would strike and kill the animal. And so this is what we call sympathetic magic. Sympathetic magic is where like impacts like or influences like. The easiest way to explain sympathetic magic is a voodoo doll. So if you have a voodoo doll, you put a pin in it, then whoever the voodoo doll is supposed to represent is going to feel pain wherever that pin was inserted. So whichever of you has the Dr. Clark voodoo doll that's put the pin in my lower back, please take it out. I'm getting kind of sore and tired of it. So this is the same kind of idea. You would go into this cave, you would paint this animal, and then you would symbolically kill it. And this would give you power over the actual animal in the hunt. So this would secure your successful hunt. That's maybe one way to think of it. Another way to think of it is maybe it's the opposite direction. Remember, when you kill an animal or any living thing, it stops moving, obviously, and the sense of its anima, its spirit, its vitality is gone. And so where does that vitality go? People in the past probably believed in ghosts or spirits in the same way we do. It's a common practice in a lot of Native American tribes that after you kill an elk or a bear, you actually honor the elk or the bear. You give some kind of offering, either in the form of tobacco or a ritual, to appease the spirit of the bear, to say, hey, I'm sorry for killing you. I just needed this. But, please don't haunt me for the rest of my life. I don't want to wake up in the middle of the night and see some scary ghost bear hanging out. And so maybe that's the intent. So maybe instead of doing this before the hunt, you do it after the hunt. That you go into the cave, into the earth, which probably represented the underworld, and you kill the spirit. You pin the spirit to the wall to prevent the spirit from hunting you. But however this works, it's obvious that they were pretty pragmatic about it. As you can see, again, looking at our example here of our rhinoceros. This poor rhinoceros got killed 7 times. That, if you have a drawing that already is there, why bother redrawing it? You could just draw a new horn or a new back, and that revitalizes it. In this way, you could reuse the same paintings or drawings over and over and over again for generations. And it becomes this very powerful thing. There's some other details, again, that indicate that they really are attempting to have a spiritual experience. They're attempting to see the spirit of the animal. Remember Altamira Cave, how they painted those bison on the existing nodules, on the kind of protrusions that existed? You can see the shadow of this protrusion here, for example, has a bison painted on it. You can see that this one in the center, the cracks, the animal is crouched, but the animal fits into the natural cracks and forms. You can see this all through this cave. And this seems to indicate that they, rather than going into the cave and imposing the animal onto the wall, they went into the cave to find the animal. That you would enter into a vision state, and you would look at the wall or the cave ceiling until you saw the animal. And so these paintings of bison are not so much paintings by the artist. It's the artist liberating the image that he's already seen. He is strengthening the vision of what he's seeing in the surface. There's some evidence of that. We can see that in other objects in sculpture when we look at these spear thrower weights. So they didn't have the bow and arrow at this time, so what they did is they had a long stick that acted as a lever, and you'd stick the spear on the end of the stick, and it's just like a 2-foot extension on your arm. But if you could put a weight on it, it would give you even more momentum and push. And so they would carve these stone weights, and they would carve them out of reindeer antler. But partially to save time, and partially because of this idea of seeing the bison in the material rather than imposing it on the material, you would carve the bison to fit the shape. So this is a reindeer antler, and you can see that the prongs of the reindeer antler, the artist has very carefully turned into the feet of the bison, and he has bent the head of the bison back to fit the already existing piece of reindeer antler. Same thing here. Here's another one. In this case, this is a reindeer antler, but he's very carefully carved it into the shape of a horse, but he has fit it to the shape of the antler. So this is the prong of the antler, and he's carved it into the prong. This not only saves time, it actually kind of honors the original spirit of the object. You often hear sculptors even today saying that you don't sculpt the stone, you release the sculpture from the stone, you find the sculpture in the stone. And so this might be evidence of pareidolia. Remember what we talked about, pareidolia, the seeing of images, the seeing of faces. And this is evidence that maybe this is not all that far removed from the Makapansgat pebble, that the Makapansgat pebble, where they looked and saw the face in the image, is not all that different. They're using their skills here, but they're still seeing it in the wall rather than just kind of creating it out of whole cloth. They're letting their natural environment inspire them to see the images. They're going into a visionary state and finding them. There are a few things in some of these cave paintings that indicate some kind of narrative. Not much, but here we have an image of what appears to be a guy under a bison skin. We know that Native Americans and other peoples would often put a bison skin over their back and sneak out into the herd so they could get closer to the animal to ensure a kill. And so that may be what's happening here. So this is kind of not just looking for a successful hunt, but kind of telling a story. There's one example from Lascaux Cave that might be telling a story too. Here we have a man, and he is on the wrong side of this bison. This bison is kind of trampling him, but we can see the bison has been run through with a spear and his bowels are falling out. So while this is very simple, it clearly gives a suggestion of some kind of story. So while most of these animals are clearly meant to be ritual and they're not narrative, they do have this capacity for narrative, this capacity to tell a story. And then that brings us right to some of the earliest sculpture from the Paleolithic period. And one of the most prominent examples are these things we call Venus figurines. Now, Venus is the name of a Roman goddess of love and fertility. We don't know if these were actually Venus. We have no idea what they were called. But because they seem to be fertility objects, we definitely associate them with Venus, and so we just kind of call them Venus figurines. That's why Venus is in quotes there. There's a number of these. This is a rather beautiful one carved from mammoth ivory. It's in pretty bad shape, but when you see the restoration, you see this figure of, it's really quite strange and bizarre. It has enormous buttocks, very large pendulous breasts, and the emphasis seems to be on not the face or the figure of the character. It doesn't really depict hands or toes or a face in any way. It's just interested in the breasts and in the buttocks. And this is a common feature of all of these. You can see that in probably the most famous Venus of this period, the Venus of Willendorf. This was found in Willendorf, Austria, and it shows, and here's a kind of animation of it to give you a sense of it. It shows a woman with, again, enormous buttocks and backside, an enormous round middle, and large breasts, and the hands rest on top of the breasts. But doesn't really show anything else. One of the things that we know about these is that they're very small. The largest of these is only about 4 or 5 inches tall. Here you can see that this one is only 4 inches tall or so, a little over 4 inches. In fact, it fits very well into the hand. And that suggests that these were personal items, that they were probably totems or talismans. There's evidence of wear. You might even call these worry dolls. As far as the faces and the hair goes, one of the things that's kind of disturbing is how they don't have faces. This one, the Venus of Brossenpoy, does have a face, but not very emphasized. people have suggested that maybe these represent wigs or headdresses, that these don't actually represent hair. Maybe these are stylized abstractions of the human form. But on the case of the Venus of Willendorf, they don't even show a face. The basket-like headdress just covers the entire face. Which brings us to the question, why are these so abstract? When we look at them, here's the Lausel woman, here is the Venus of Willendorf. When we look at the Venus of Lesbun, you can tell that they're very, very abstract and very stylized. And here's where I need to introduce a couple of terms that we're going to be using a lot: naturalism and abstraction. Naturalism is any art in imitation of nature or based on forms existing in nature. You might call this realism. And what's interesting is that in the prehistoric period, we have art that's incomparably naturalistic for its time. Again, I mentioned this thing has a really accurate sense of perspective, has an incredible sense of details, has a sense of the anatomy and the modeling and the form of the creature. Abstraction, on the other hand, is things that don't look like nature, things that are clearly exaggerated. Women don't look like this. So you think you have body image issues today because of the covers of Cosmo? Holy cow. Just think of what prehistoric women had to go through. Their unrealistic body expectations. So clearly this is not meant to represent a real woman. It is a stylized image and is obviously meant to represent some kind of concept. So the question becomes, why is the human figure so stylized? Human figures in cave paintings are very, very rare. The animals are almost often naturalistic, but the figures are abstract. When you look at this guy, he has a bird-like head, and about the only thing that we can say is that the artist definitely wanted us to know this was male. But other than that, it's a simple stick figure. They haven't given nearly as much time or consideration to the form of the human as they have to the animal. Maybe that's because there's a religious prohibition or practice. Maybe there's some kind of idea that if you capture the likeness of a human being, you are capturing their soul. And that makes sense if we think about this in terms of sympathetic magic. If the whole point of painting these animals is to capture their anima, their spirit, so you have power over them, then maybe there is a religious prohibition against depicting humans because you don't want to be accused of stealing somebody's soul. This is where we also get into another discussion that we're going to be talking throughout this course. So definitely remember naturalism and abstraction. We're going to be talking about naturalism and abstraction all throughout this course. All cultures develop naturalism, and not just Western civilization. All cultures develop abstraction. And we in the West tend to think of naturalistic art as good art, or at least we did until the 20th century, because we have this very strong tradition of naturalism. But it's really not the case of good or bad. It's about what's appropriate. Sometimes it's better to use abstraction to communicate than it is to use likeness. Let's just go back all the way to the beginning of the lecture. Let's think about our smiley face. This is an abstraction, but if you wanted to just communicate just happiness, it would be much easier and much more efficient to draw this than it would be to bother to try to put ears on it and an anatomically accurate nose, and the forehead is just kind of crazy and thing. It's much easier just to let that all go and do something simple. So it's not a question of which is better. It's which is better for the circumstances or the context that you're creating in. One of the other big concepts that we're going to talk about a lot is this concept of presence and likeness. These are ideas that come from the art historian Hans Belting. He wrote a book on this, a very important book called Images in the Era Before Art. It's about medieval art. And what he says is that, there's two ways that we can conceive of an image. One is likeness. That's whether it's an artwork that looks like the original and tries to capture its appearance in real life. The other concept is presence. And this is artwork that is not meant to convey the way it actually looks. It's meant to convey its presence. So when we look at something like these paintings of bison, it's very clear that they're trying to use likeness to convey presence. Whereas in the case of the Venus figurines, they're clearly trying to convey a presence, but they're not trying to use likeness. It's important to know that these concepts are not mutually exclusive. Sometimes presence is conveyed through likeness, sometimes it's conveyed by abstraction. For example, a cross is not really an image of Jesus Christ, but to many Christians it conveys the presence of Christ, although in a simplified or symbolic way. And sometimes, by creating a painting that is so lifelike, people say it's eerie because it seems as if that person is actually there. So sometimes likeness and presence overlap. And that brings us back into the question of, okay, so if they're using likeness to try and capture the presence or the essence of the bison, why are they using abstraction in the depiction of the human form? And I think this gets back to this idea of them being personal totems or talismans. I have a picture on my wall of my great-grandfather, Ole Lassen, and in that picture he is surrounded by 8 of his 14 children. 6 of his children had either died before that that picture was taken, or they hadn't been born yet. Overall, out of 14 children, only 7 of them lived to adulthood. Now, that may sound like a personal tragedy, but it's actually relatively common. It's not until the 1880s that most women could hope that most of their children would live into adulthood. I think about that for a moment. The infant mortality rate, the childhood mortality rate, added up to over 50%. That means that half of all the people born never got to be adults. They either died as infants or died in childhood. And that's even before we get to how many people died in childbirth, how many women died in childbirth. So, we live in an age of, modern hospitals and medicine, and so childbirth isn't this horrible, dangerous affair that it once was. But in the Paleolithic, you have to believe they were very much concerned about it. And it hasn't escaped our notice that the forms that they emphasize are the forms associated with childbirth and child rearing. Breasts, because these are used to nurse, large hips and abdomens, because these indicate fitness for pregnancy. And that's why they don't spend so much time on the faces or the heads, because that's not what's important. These aren't depictions of individual people. These are depictions of an idea, and that idea is the idea of fertility, the idea of giving you a sense of control over things that you don't control. And this is where we begin to understand what these things are for, whether it's the cave painting or whether it's the Venus of Willendorf. These are tools. Art is a tool in a way. Again, it's not a traditional tool. It is a tool that helps you manage the unmanageable. Let me put this a different way. If you're hungry and you're living in the Paleolithic, you can make a spear point, you can go kill an animal and eat it. If you're cold, you can skin its skin with a stone blade, and you can put its skin on, and you can keep yourself warm. But what do you do if you're anxious? What do you do if you're anxious about the possibility of failing in the hunt? That's the difference between life and death. What do you do if you're anxious about your wife and her impending childbirth, the impending childbirth of birth of your child? These are very risky things, and so you can't manage those. So artwork is a way of making the internal external, and it gives us a physical object to interact with, so that we can work on things like our worry, our anxiety, our fears, it sounds pretty negative, but it also can be positive things. Our hopes, our joys, our aspirations, our hopes for an afterlife, or our belief in the divine or the sublime. All of these things give us greater expression. And so that explains what art is. It is this externalization of the internal. And you can see that in these objects. You know, maybe the Venus of Willendorf was made by a mother for her child when she became of childbearing age. Or maybe it was made by a husband for a wife. We don't know. But it definitely was a personal item, something, you could call it a totem, a talisman, a worry doll if you like, something to hold on to so that they could hope for a successful birth and a successful rearing of a child into adulthood. The same thing with the bison. The bison was a way of saying, no, we're not helpless in this hunt. We can tap into some higher powers. Now, whether you believe in the metaphysical or the supernatural or not, it doesn't matter. It's clear that they gave these people this sense of control over some of their darkest fears. And speaking of darkest fears, it's time I shared one of mine. Mickey Mouse. Okay, so I know I dissed a lot on the mouse in the last lecture. Now you're going to find out why. Because it's personal. This is when you all think I've gone nuts. But Mickey Mouse always spooked me a bunch as a little kid. Because whenever you saw him in person, like in Disneyland, he was 6 feet tall and he had big ears that, you know, obeyed the laws of perspective. And he never spoke. He was always silent. It was bizarre. But when you saw him in cartoons, he was maybe a foot or two high. And he laughed and he talked. And but the weirdest thing were his ears. His ears did not obey the laws of physics. It didn't matter which way he was pointing, if he was facing away from you or facing sideways to you. His ears moved around his head like they had a will of their own, and they did not obey the laws of physics. I mean, you can just see the difference between these two. Just to illustrate this, one time when I was at Disneyland with my kids, I had them put on their Mickey Mouse ears, and then I had them wear them sideways just to show how ridiculous this looks. Okay. Now, this is just me pointing out how old I am. This is my niece. She's now in her 20s, and she has 4 children. This is my daughter, who is now 23. And this is my son, who is 4 months away from completing his mission. I got old. Life comes at you quick. Okay, let's get back to let's get back to the topic at the moment. When you look at these ears, you realize, okay, well, that's ridiculous. But there's a reason why Mickey Mouse is the way he is. When Walt Disney was creating Mickey Mouse, he was doing it for animation. In animation, you have to draw 24 frames a second. That means every second of film, he had to draw those ears 24 times. And after a while, he just said, screw it, I'm done. I'm not going to draw these things in perspective. I'm going to draw these things as just simple circles. It was just a reduction. It was just a simple cheat to get away from having to bother with it. It was just a simple, cheap, easy way to do it. And it only bothered kids like me because we were very particular about that. Well, let's take a look at these cave paintings. Yes, this Mickey Mouse is relevant to these cave paintings. When you look at this bison, we're looking at the head in profile. The head is right there. But look at the horns. Do you notice something funny? The horns are in 3/4 view. If I was in person, I could demonstrate this a little better. But the horns actually have to be pointing in completely different directions in order for this to happen. In other words, the artist blended views. The profile of the bison's head is in a profile view, but the horns are in 3/4 view. And you see this everywhere you go in these caves. And this is where we get into the discussion of convention and naturalism. So we've already established that naturalism is painting things as you see it, a kind of realistically. But convention is an artistic device. It's a way of conveying what you know to be true or what the artist wants the viewer to see. And you can see it. This is from Lascaux Cave. Here in Lascaux Cave, you can see that the bison here is in profile, but the horns are in 3/4. The horns here behave like Mickey Mouse's ears. The artist has cheated. Here at Chauvet Cave, you can see that the artist understood that the horns should kind of line up, but he didn't quite know how to do it, so he just put one horn just a little bit behind the other. And the reason we point this out is to say that even at this early date, artists were not being honest. No art is purely naturalistic. I want you to remember that. All art cheats. That is, every artist since the history of history, since the beginning of prehistory, has cheated to convey not reality, but what they want us to see. Why is this important? Because conventions are a way we communicate meaning. They're devices. And I love this illustration because the stick figure doesn't look anything like a human being. Just like that smiley face doesn't look anything like a smiley face. It's a convention. It's a way of showing what we believe to be true, what we want people to understand. It is a triumph of the concept over reality. And it gives us things like symbolism and iconography. And even things that we would think were pretty naturalistic end up being really not as naturalistic as we think. And sometimes we don't see that. And that's a very important thing as we look forward in art going from this point forward, that we say, hey, wait a minute. The artist has pulled a fast one here because he wants us to look at something else. And it's just amazing to me that this is true even from the very earliest days of prehistoric art, that they understood that there had to be a kind of change in order for the thing to look a little bit more probable, that they played with the laws of physics to make things happen. And one of the best ways you can see that is in this thing. So far, everything we've seen up to this point has been within the realm of the real. There really were great auks. There really were Ice Age bison and woolly mammoths and all kinds of crazy things that don't exist anymore, but they did exist. And there certainly were women. They exaggerated the dimensions of their features and exaggerated the features associated with childbirth and child rearing, but there were women. But we also get things like this. And this may be the oldest statue in human creation, sometimes called the Lion Man or Lion God. It's sometimes actually called the Lion Goddess. There's an intense debate of whether this is male or female, but we're not going to get into that. But what it is it is an anthropomorphized lion. So there you are. If you're a furry, be proud. Anthro, be proud. The oldest art in the world is anthro art. You have a figure that stands upright like a human being, but it clearly has the head of a lion. And so we're seeing that there is this change, this shift in the way humans think. This really advanced ability, the ability first to take images and to use those to convey concepts, but also to mix and match, to take parts and pieces from other areas to make new concepts, to make the idea of the spirit of the lion, or of the anima, or the god of the lion, or a lion figure. Does this represent the spirit or the god or a shaman transforming into a lion? There's all kinds of theories put forward, but it definitely represents that they're thinking even beyond the real to the conceptual. And briefly, let's just finally close this out with architecture. One of the big, misassumptions of art of the prehistoric period is that these are made by cavemen. And while they did live in caves, really by the time we hit the Ice Age, Cro-Magnons had stopped living in caves. The truth is, caves aren't very convenient. If you're a hunter and you've got to chase down animals, the cave doesn't move, and you need to follow the animals. So they actually lived in tents. And these tents were made out of, wooden poles and animal skins, but they weighted those animal skins down with the things that they had on hand. And if you're killing mammoths, what you have on hand is mammoth bones. And so out on the steppes of Russia, they found the foundations of a prehistoric hut, one of the earliest pieces of architecture. And inside it, they found a wealth of mammoth bones, and the mammoth bones were used to weigh down the animal skins, but they also were decorated. So we have this mammoth skull that has incised decorations, and these decorations were probably filled with paint or pigment as well. It's a very simple kind of architecture, but it demonstrates that even at this point there was this sense of ornamentation and decoration, an aesthetic sense even beyond what we see in the cave paintings. The cave paintings are about, again, externalizing the internal, this sympathetic magic, this control or mastery of your environment in a metaphysical, mystical, or supernatural way. But this shows that even the mundane things, there is this innate aesthetic sense to our earliest ancestors to decorate, to create beauty purely for the sake of it. Okay, that seems like a good place to stop. We'll stop there. I'll load this one up today. On Friday, look for Neolithic art and the beginnings of the ancient Near East. I know that's a lot of lectures in a single day, but remember, this is a summer session, so the lectures are kind of doubled up. And again, you can listen to these as you're at your leisure, but don't let it go too long. If you have any questions about this lecture, make sure to comment down below in the discussion group on Canvas. Or if you have any questions about the course, feel free to email me anytime. Okay, bye-bye.